What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so before I get into this video, I want to give a big shout out to the brother Henry for the $10 donation via the Cash App. And he asked me a question. He asked me if the 22nd Amendment had not uh, been passed or ratified, I should say, back in, what was it, 1951, had the 22nd Amendment not come into effect, how many three-term presidents would we have had? Now, before I go forward with my opinion on this, we have to keep in mind that we've only had one president to ever serve more than two terms. That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served from 1933 to 1945. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected four times: in 1932, 1936, 1940, and then in the midst of World War II, 1944. Now, just 82 days into his fourth term, he died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 63. As far as presidents who sought a third term, to my recollection, we've had only a small handful that attempted to do so. I know one of them was Ulysses S. Grant. I believe he attempted to seek a third term in 1880, but his attempt at securing the nomination for a third term in 1880 failed, and the Republican Party instead nominated James A. Garfield, who became president, defeating, I believe the candidate name was William S. Hancock, in one of the closest popular vote elections of all time, winning that popular vote by, I think, only a margin of 7,000 out of nearly 9 million votes cast at the time. Of course, James A. Garfield was only president for, I think, something around 6 months before he died of wounds from a shooting in July of 1881. I know there were a couple of other ones who sought a third term. I think Woodrow Wilson, although stroke damaged, was flirting with the idea of going for a third term, but it would have not have worked at all. I think he was really being delusional at that point. There's a couple other ones that I think tried to get a third term, but anyway, let's get to this. Dwight D. Eisenhower, all right? Dwight D. Eisenhower served as president from 1953 to 1961. He was elected in 1952 in a landslide, defeating Adlai Stevenson by electoral college vote of 442 to 89, captured 55.1% of the popular vote. Was reelected in 1956 against Adlai Stevenson the second time, beating him by an even bigger margin, winning 57.4% of the popular vote against Stevenson's 42%. The electoral college was 457 for Eisenhower, just 73 for Stevenson, with one Stevenson elector voting for, I forgot who he voted for, but he did vote for Stevenson. Now, could he have won the third term in 1960? If he was constitutionally allowed to run for a third term, I don't think he would have ran for a third term. Primarily for two reasons. Number one, his health. Eisenhower, in his first term in September of 1955, while on vacation in Colorado, suffered a major heart attack, which led to some speculations of whether or not he would run again for a second term in the first place. And then in his second term, He suffered, I think it was in 1956, he suffered a bout of ileitis, which required a surgery on his part. And in 1957, he suffered a mild stroke. And one of the determining factors as to why Richard Nixon narrowly lost to John F. Kennedy, aside from the fact that he had a terrible strategy of trying to visit all 50 states instead of just focusing on the electoral rich states of the Northeast and Midwest, which he should have did. Uh, Eisenhower, for the most part, did not campaign for Nixon. Part of that was because of his health. Matter of fact, his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, the first lady at the time, pleaded with the vice president who was running for president at the time to not have Eisenhower campaign because she felt that the strain of campaigning uh, for Eisenhower might trigger a heart attack. And the other main reason related to his age was his, excuse me, related to his health was his age. Eisenhower was 70 years old back when 70 years old was considered old. So I don't think he would have ran for a third term, even if he had been constitutionally allowed to do so. Now this brings me to the man I just mentioned, his eventual successor, though not directly to the presidency, Richard M. Nixon. Richard M. Nixon served as president from 1969 to 1974. Now, before I even take him into consideration, uh, he wouldn't have been able to do so because he didn't even finish his second term because of the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal effectively ended Richard Nixon's political career. Of course, he resigned in disgrace in August of 1974. So there's, even if he was technically allowed to run again, he would have not had the support to even win, I would say, even a primary state. If he even seriously tried to run, I don't think he would have been able to get donors, backers. Uh, his political career was over. I mean, in real life, he was able to rebuild his reputation somewhat. He was a frequent guest on platforms as far as discussing foreign policy. He wrote a multitude of books, and he was regarded as an elder statesman in the political ranks. But his political career, as far as actively serving, was over. This brings me to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, of course, served as president from 1981 to 1989. He was elected in a landslide over Jimmy Carter in 1980. And in 1984, he won one of the biggest landslides of all time, defeating Walter Mondale in a tsunami, winning 54 million votes versus Mondale's 37 million. And he won 49 states except for Minnesota, which was won by Walter Mondale, which was his home state. He only lost that state by 4,000 votes out of a little over 2 million cast. So so Reagan came very close to a 50-state sweep. Could he have won a third term if he was allowed to? He could have. I think he could have. He would not have won 49 states. Let's say he runs against the caucus. I don't think he would have won 49 states. But if you look at the fact that George H.W. Bush, his vice president, beat Michael Dukakis rather handily, coming back from a 17-point deficit in July of 1988 in the polls to win a decisive electoral landslide, 426 for Bush. Dukakis won 111. One elector voted for Lloyd Bentsen, who was actually his vice president. I think he had around 53% of the vote. Dukakis 46%. Um, you stand to think that Reagan would have won decisively, though he would not have won by as big a margin. And there would have been questions about his age. Okay, he he was 70. I think he would have been 77 on inauguration day had he served a third term. And also, of course, there were questions about his mental acuity. In real life, of course, Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in, I think it was November of 1994. And when you look in hindsight, although I don't think that Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's during his second term, I do believe he was suffering some level of mild cognitive impairment or decline by the end of his second term. So I do think that Reagan could have won a third term. Though I think ultimately, had he did that, and he was allowed to do so, it would have probably, I would assume, there would have been further cognitive decline. And knowing how he fared in real life, I think he ultimately would have resigned in his third term due to a lack of mental fitness as the years progressed. So that brings me to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, of course, served as president from 1993 to 2001. He won in a three-man race against George H.W. Bush and H. Ross Perot in 1992, winning an electoral landslide, and he won another electoral landslide against Bob Dole and H. Ross Perot in 1996. Could he have won a third term? Now, in this scenario, we're assuming that his opponent is George W. Bush. Now, I don't want to make this too overcomplicated, so I'm just making the opponent the same as was the case in those elections. Uh, I, I tend to think he would have beaten George W. Bush, but considering that when you look at the fact that George W. Bush's campaign was effectively a reaction to the excesses and scandals of the Clinton administration, if he was actually running against Bill Clinton, because essentially when he was running against Al Gore, he was running against the Clinton administration, uh, Bush. To run against the guy, I'm thinking there would have been an even greater turnout in this election as far as conservatives. I think this election would have been pretty close, but I think Clinton squeaks it out because I remember one of the things that many voters were saying back then was, well, Clinton may not be a good person, but we think he's a good president. And it was trying to make a separation between Clinton's service as president and the man who they thought was a scumbag. That would have hurt him, obviously. In a two-man race, I think the election is a lot tighter, but I think Bill Clinton probably would have squeaked it out. And remember, Bill Clinton was only 54 years old at the time, young by presidential standards, so I don't think age would have been an issue. They're about the same age, actually. So I think Clinton squeaks out a third term. So this brings me to George W. Bush, who served as president from 2001 to 2009. He narrowly defeated Al Gore. Many people, including myself, believe that in actuality, he lost because in actually, when you look at the evidence, more people intended to vote for Al Gore in Florida than George W. Bush, but something like 20 to 25,000 votes were thrown out by the Florida, basically by the state of Florida. Most of those votes came from majority Democratic counties. It is what it is. George W. Bush was reelected against John Kerry in 2004. Would he have beaten, let's just say he ran against Barack Obama in 2008? If he was able to, let's just say that. I don't see a scenario where he wins. If he's actually running against Barack Obama, and let's just say things were the same, and Barack is actually running against George W. Bush, who had a 25% approval rating on election day 2008, I think, if anything, Barack Obama wins by an even larger margin than he did against John McCain. I don't want to put numbers on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was an 8+ point popular vote victory and electoral college victory, maybe even hovering over 400 electoral votes. He would have creamed them. So this brings me to the last guy, Barack Obama, who I don't really particularly care for right now. He served as president from 2009 to 2017. As I said, he beat John McCain decisively in 2008, and he beat Mitt Romney by a closer margin, but still considerable margin in 2012. Now, what would have happened if he ran against Donald Trump in 2016? At the time, people may forget this, but Barack Obama left office with something around a 56% approval rating. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that he wasn't under the microscope anymore. The focus was on Hillary Clinton, And sometimes when a politician is out of spotlight and hovers in the background, people tend to look at them with a little bit more rosier lens. I tend to think that if Barack Obama was able to run for a third term, he would have done it. I think of all the presidents, he would have been the most likely to do it, along with Bill Clinton. Knowing Barack Obama's skill as a orator, as a motivator of getting out the base, it's almost like the Obamas have a trance over the Democratic Party and their followers. I tend to think that he would have beaten Trump and rather easily. Hillary Clinton was not a really good politician, and she still came relatively close to beating Trump. Although electoral college wasn't that close, many of those states were really close. I tend to think Barack Obama would have beaten Trump by a bigger margin than he beat Mitt Romney. Um, Maybe something around 350 electoral votes. And I think he would have won pretty handily. That's just my opinion. So, look, in conclusion, I'm saying that if the 22nd Amendment did not exist, I think Ronald Reagan would have won a third term, although he probably would have had to resign. Uh, Probably would have had to resign because the mental acuity, the loss of mental acuity, and as he began to enter his Alzheimer's symptoms, I think that would have been more apparent. And it's possible he may have had to resign sometime around 1991, maybe into 1992, especially 1992, if, let's say, his vice president, whoever that was running for president himself to legitimize him. Maybe Reagan resigns, rides off to the sunset. The vice president now has the presidency as he runs for a term in his own right. That's a possibility. I think Bill Clinton would have gotten the third term, and I think Barack Obama would have gotten the third term. Now let's go on. Let's just mention Trump. If he somehow does get elected next week, I shouldn't say somehow, it's a possibility. I don't see him running for a third term because he'll just be simply too old. And I think the Republican Party and America would just be done with Trump by that point in time, just exhausted with him. If he runs, if he will, excuse me, next week, he'll be 82 years old if he ran again in 2028, just far too old. And I think America will just be tired of him. I think the Republican Party will be tired of him and want to move on. Uh, so that's my thoughts on this. But tell me what you guys think.